Okay, welcome everybody to the December edition of the ENSO seminars. We're going to do the usual thing of waiting for about 5 minutes or so to let some of the other people who have expressed interest in join us for the live session today for Christian's talk. So we'll just hang out for a little bit and wait for those people to join. One thing that we're hoping to kick off in the near future or with future ENSO seminars is a bit of an announcement session, so that rather than sitting around and just waiting for the time to pass as people join, we can spread the news of any publications or other news that you have, positions maybe that come available, PhD positions, postdoc positions, all those good kinds of things. And we can use this as a bit of a platform for advertising things related to our community. So if you have things, please email me or Marek, and we'll do our best to help you out promoting what you would like to promote.
Cool.
Yeah. So Christian's joining us here in Goldsmiths University at this point. Is that right, Christian?
That's right. Yeah, I'm sitting in London right now. 7 p.m. Wonderful time. Yeah, and I hope there are a few more people from the UK who have a chance to tune in, but let's see. It's probably a bit too late for them.
Right.
Talking about papers and publications, Matthew. I was wondering, have you ever published a follow-up paper to the quantifying viability one from A-Life 2016?
No. So yeah, it's been a crazy few years of moving around a bit, and I'm looking forward to getting back to some of those ideas. But no, all of that research has sadly been on hold a little bit. And similarly, I've been wanting to get back to the stuff I did with on habits with the IDSM with Xavier, and it's just, yeah, it's hard to find the time. But the plan is in the new year to redouble my efforts there. The teaching's finally calming down in my position here, and there's time for research. So fingers crossed, we'll be able to get there.
What are you teaching over there?
A couple of different courses. So I'm teaching in the new year. I'll be teaching a paper called Interactive and Cognitive Systems, and it used to be a very Go-Fi paper, and I came in teaching a portion of it as a bit of an antagonist, saying these are the ideas that I came in the first 2/3 of the course are teaching these Go-Fi ideas, and then I came in the last third and say, well, those are interesting, those have been helpful in a lot of ways, but they really don't help us understand the way our brains work and everything. Can we take more inspiration from natural brains and natural forms of intelligence? And yeah, but I'm slowly corrupting the course increasingly in the inactive direction, which is fun. That's what I like to do.
That's really exciting. Huh? Yeah, cool. Well, I'm looking forward to some follow-up work on your quantifying viability stuff. It's actually quite relevant to what I'm talking about today. So
okay, cool. That sounds great.
That would be very exciting.
Yeah, and you've sent the links out now to the people that you're hoping will join us, so they should be joining us shortly.
I sent a couple of links out, but I know that they have only like tentatively agreed.
Okay.
I know one of them, at least, my collaborator on this work is still in a meeting, so they might join in later.
Okay, sounds good. And I see Peter Cariani, you've joined. Can you hear me, or can I hear you? I can't hear you, and I don't see your video either. I see you've just muted yourself. So we've got a connection somehow, but some of the audio and video connections are not yet working. And we've got a couple of people that are also watching this, not in the participating thing, but we've got a couple of people that are watching as well. So that's good. We got a bit of a turnout today. It's nice.
Cool.
Okay, I'm gonna sneeze, at least try to sneeze. Now that I've mentioned that I'm gonna sneeze, I probably won't, and then maybe we can start. Yep, yeah, as soon as you say something about sneezing, it makes the sneeze go away. Okay, I don't know, Peter, sorry, we still can't hear you. I don't know if you want to try to disconnect and reconnect, perhaps with a different browser. I know people have been having issues with browsers other than Chrome, so that might be something that you try so that when the time comes, you can ask some questions and so on in the Q&A. And with that, I think, Christian, I'm going to put the camera on you
Cool.
and ask you to go ahead and share your slides. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce Christian, who's going to be talking about investigating the role of empowerment maximization in constitutive autonomy, adaptivity, and open-ended development. I'm really looking forward to this talk. And yeah, please go for it and take it away for us. And I'm just going to mute myself. So again, if it sounds like you've been disconnected, you haven't been. I'm still here.
Brilliant. Let me quickly know. Can you see those slides?
Yes, I can see those slides. Yeah, looks good.
Wonderful. Cool. Okay, let's start then.
Right.
Yeah, so I thought I'd probably introduce myself first of all. I'm Christian. Probably not very familiar to everyone in the community. Only been working with active. I think I can hear an echo. Well,
yeah, no, it's okay. Sorry, it was Peter joining. I'm just gonna mute you, Peter, because you've got some echo on. So I'm gonna mute you.
I just turned off the speaker.
Okay, great. I'm still going to mute you during the course of Christian's talk.
I can't seem to get my video camera working, so sorry.
That's no big deal. Okay.
No worries. Cool.
Take it away, Christian.
No worries. So yeah, I was just about to introduce myself. I'm a PhD student in the Computational Creativity Group at Goldsmiths, University of London. And well, my main research is about leveraging formal mathematical models of intrinsic motivation, or what we consider intrinsic motivation, to engineer artificial systems that can be considered creative in their own right. And as one part of my research, I also look into activism, in particular inactive AI, and relate the intrinsic motivation models to that. The work I'm going to discuss today, which is exactly about that, relating one particular model of intrinsic motivation, namely empowerment maximization, to constitutive autonomy, adaptivity, and open-ended development as some central notions in activism. So this work has been conducted together with Christoph Salge, who's been at University of Hertfordshire and at the moment, who's at the moment at NYU, and who might be joining us in later on. So to talk a bit about the motivation of that, I mean, you know that, but just to provide some ground for what I'm going to say. In activism, of course, or more precisely, what some would call the autopoietic branch of activism, posits that all living beings actively, so by means of interacting with the environment, bring forth a unique world of meaning or world. So agency is recast as sense-making. This sense-making is footed on two essential concepts. There is autopoiesis as the minimal organization of life, which provides us with a basic normativity. And there is adaptivity, which makes this normativity accessible to the system itself and allows it to act accordingly in order to defend its organization against perturbations in the environment. So in other words, living beings, as suggested by activism, have an intrinsic teleology based on the continuity of the identity, which demands constant action. This action allows such beings to assign values to and discriminate features of the environment in terms of what is beneficial or detrimental to their purpose. So, why am I interested in that? Well, I'm working a lot with something called empowerment, and you could just call it whatever you want. Please don't be confused with this notion. Empowerment is an information theoretic quantity which measures intuitively a system's potential perceivable influence on the environment, including the system itself. Empowerment maximization then is a model of intrinsic motivation, a model that allows an artificial agent to choose an action in order to maximize empowerment. Models of intrinsic motivation, as defined in computer science, are all about selecting actions independently of extrinsically defined goals. And well, I'm fascinated by the question, how does this intrinsicness of empowerment or of computational models of intrinsic motivation actually relate to the intrinsic teleology and to the proposals of cognition and autopoietic activism? And there are two goals. There is a long-term goal, or let's start with a short-term goal. There's a short-term goal in which we're interested how the behavior of empowerment-driven, synthetically engineered physical or virtually embodied artificial agents relate to cognition as emerging from the essence of life, but also to understand what's actually missing here. The long-term goal is about engineering artificial systems with intentional agency and sense-making, so that's all building on Tom Fröse's and Tom Zinke's idea of enactive AI, that are capable of interacting with their environment as autonomously and flexible as living beings while retaining their special abilities. We're also interested in probing the enactivist theory of cognition in actual implementation studies, and therefore move closer to artificial life's goal of creating life as it could be. And we're interested in providing cool tools to the study of goal-oriented behavior and of ethics. So, importantly, we have already published a version of these arguments at A-Live 2016. However, I urge you to take this with a grain of salt. Viewed in retrospect, our arguments in this paper have been gently put quite inaccurate. So one goal of this talk is actually to revisit these arguments and to revisit the relationship of empowerment, empowerment maintenance, and empowerment maximization with constitutive autonomy and adaptivity. So in this talk, I'm going to make 3 rather strong claims, or investigate those claims at least. First of all, there is the claim that any autopoietic agent necessarily conserves empowerment. Second, any adaptive agent must necessarily maintain empowerment. And third, we investigate whether it is sufficient for a system to maintain empowerment in order to be considered an adaptive agent. And if there's some time left, and I think we probably rather do that in discussion, I will also look into the relationship of empowerment maximization and open-ended development, a very interesting development in enactive AI. So, as kind of a disclaimer, this work is still pretty much work in progress. And, well, one goal of this is to get actually some valuable feedback from you, the enactive community. And I hope you comment on this on YouTube or whatever, and I really hope to get a discussion going and actually just develop these arguments further. At this point, I want to say many thanks, especially to Tom Fröse and Paulo de Jesus, for giving me really, really valuable feedback and helping me find my way along while digging down the enactivism literature rabbit hole and actually revisiting those arguments. Okay, so to start with, I will quickly look again at the notions of autopoiesis and adaptivity. This might feel like an unnecessary detour at first, given that this is a dedicated enactivist seminar series. However, I learned that the distinction between these concepts is less clear than anticipated, at least for me. Additionally, we limit our claims to a subset of autopoietic systems, so there's a need to add a bit more detail here. So, what do we actually mean when we say autopoiesis, generally speaking? Well, of course, autopoiesis is a theory of the minimal living organism, defined as a network of processes of production, so the synthesis and destruction of components, such that these components continuously regenerate and realize the network that produces them, and second, constitute the system as a distinguishable unity in a domain in which they exist. Well, although not implied in this definition, autopoietic systems are usually considered as material, dissipative systems existing under far from equilibrium conditions. So, an autopoietic system's existence therefore is precarious in that its organization is constantly threatened by entropic forces. As a consequence, autopoietic systems must remain energetically and materially open by means of a structural coupling with the environment. The environment thus becomes an essential counterpart rather than a mere source of potentially detrimental perturbations. However, there's a crucial distinction here between the conservation of autopoiesis and homeostasis. And that's a crucial distinction that Di Paolo actually made in his well-known 2005 paper. So, for the continuous realization and regeneration of processes in the autopoietic network, we can distinguish between simple conservation of autopoiesis by means of mere structural coupling and homeostasis as active regulation of the structural coupling. So we can use this distinction then to delineate what Di Paolo refers to as autopoietic simpliciter systems from the bigger class of what I refer to as autopoiesis generis system, or just general autopoietic systems. autopoiesis simpliciter allows for no decrease and only entails the conservation of organization, or what Barandiaran and Moreno refer to as structural stability. And I think that it is this form of autopoiesis simpliciter that Fröse and Ziemke in their 2009 an active AI paper also referred to as constitutive autonomy. And please correct me if I'm wrong. This class of autopoiesis generis systems is then complemented by adaptive systems. So homeostasis, in contrast to the conservation of autopoiesis, entails the existence of active mechanisms capable of managing and controlling the network of processes that construct the organism. So in addition to executing a constructive or interactive process that contributes to self-maintenance, the system is also capable of switching between different alternatives according to external changes. And that's what we usually note with autopoietic adaptive systems. In order to have regulatory control over other processes, the system must then exhibit a relative decoupling between the dynamics of a regulatory subsystem and that of its basic constitutive organization. So, with this scene set here, I will come to our first argument, which is that any autopoietic agent necessarily conserves empowerment. And by saying autopoietic agent, we follow a distinction made by Barandiaran and Moreno in 2008 based on different process types in the autopoietic network. And I highlighted them here. What you can see in yellow is what we consider autopoietic agents. So, since any autopoietic simpliciter system or any autopoietic simpliciter system must necessarily engage in at least some form of minimal interaction with the environment to satisfy its energetic or material dependencies. So we can differentiate between constructive processes that participate in the continuous production of the system from interactive processes that work on the interface between the system and its environment to facilitate the required flow of matter and energy. However, this interaction can either be active or it can be passive. So we have passive interactive processes that are induced from outside the system. And we can contrast them with active interactive processes that are constrained by the system's own organization. And in short, we will call these active interactive processes interaction processes. It's probably going to get a bit confusing. My apologies for that. Barandiaran and Moreno then consider an autopoietic agent as those systems that actively interact with their environments so that the changes produced between the system and its environment contribute to its self-maintenance. So we're talking about those systems with active interactive processes where these interactive active processes actually induce functional changes in the environment. So changes that feed back into the maintenance of the organization of the system or the conservation of autopoiesis in this case. So in order to get a bit closer to our argument, we have to look at the causalities in the network of processes of such an autopoietic agent. So we start with an abstract system with the boundary or the membrane separating it from its environment. Following the definition of autopoiesis, we then first consider the system's network of constructive processes and its causal influence on the membrane. Following the assumption of material and energetic dependencies, we then have to expand this initial network with interactive processes. For convenience, we summarize the initial constructive network then into a single node. So that's the white node here. Now, we can consider the whole system of processes as a causal Bayesian network. We do so by describing the state of each process as a random variable. And we represent these variables with Latin letters. So we have environmental processes E, active processes A, passive processes P, and a summarized constructive network. So, while the organization of an autopoiesis simpliciter system is time invariant in terms of the system cannot perform any active regulation during its lifetime, the environment is not, and we thus have to consider these variables unrolled over time. We thus summarize all variables of one kind into a vector of their values at a given time t. So we got a causal Bayesian network here, unrolled in time. So in that case, the variables ET, AT, and PT represent all environmental as well as all active passive system processes at time t, and we got this constructive network as I. I think, yeah, that letter is missing from the figure, I'm afraid. So, to come to our actual argument, we claim that any autopathic agent necessarily conserves empowerment. And we separate this into two subclaims. We first look into the claim that to preserve its minimal agency, an autopathic agent necessarily conserves empowerment. Now, since simple autopathic agency or minimal agency in autopathic simpliciter per definition entails the activeness of interaction processes. So we distinguish activation of processes here from process types. We have active interactive processes and passive interactive processes, and we have activated active interactive processes. So that's what I'm saying here. So the definition of agency entails the activeness of active interaction processes. And if there's activity in any process, there must also be the option for inactivity, of course. So without loss of generality, we consider interaction processes to have only these two states of being active or inactive, without any graduations of activity.
Christian?
Yes.
Can I just interrupt for a second to ask a quick clarification question to make sure that I'm following?
Sure.
You're talking about the active versus passive interactive processes, and what I'm thinking about when I hear that is essentially sensors and motors, where the passive interactive processes are some kind of, might often be described as sensors, and the active ones might be considered mechanisms through which the agent could influence its environment. Is that essentially the right idea?
I think that's the right idea. I'm just not sure if we could actually call them sensors and motors in an autopathic simpliciter system where the system cannot perform any active regulation.
Okay.
That's why I quite strictly try to refer to them as passive interactive and active interactive processes.
Okay. And what you're talking about here with the activated, you're just talking about whether or not these systems are engaged or operating or not in the moment. Is that right?
Whether the processes are in a state where they can operate.
Where they can operate. Okay, cool. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. Well, so coming back to the argument, without loss of generality, we consider interaction processes to have only these two states of being active or inactive, without any graduations of activity. Per definition, an autopathic agent must interact with its environment. And that's a quote. So that the changes produced between the systems and its environment contribute to self-maintenance. Interaction processes thus have a functional role, realized by causing changes in the environment which reflect in the system's passive processes necessary for self-maintenance. The self-organized autopathic system would not qualify as agent if it had not functional interactive processes, functional active interactive processes, or as we will call them, interaction processes. And it would also not be called an agent if these processes were not activated. We must thus associate the active state of the interaction processes with the potential to realize this functional role, because the system cannot switch between different states. It cannot actively switch between these different states, so it must have evolved with these states being active and fulfilling the functional role. Empowerment, and this looks really awfully complicated, but in fact it isn't. Empowerment is defined as the capacity of an information theoretic communication channel. So that's what the argmax of mutual information between Y and X stands for. And it's measured between interaction and passive processes at consecutive time steps. So that's what we're doing here. We take this channel capacity, which is the maximum mutual information between two random variables, and we apply it to our passive and active interactive processes. So if measured between interaction and passive processes at consecutive time steps, empowerment quantifies the system's potential to influence its passive states in the future via its interaction processes. It is non-zero if the interaction process is functional in terms of influencing the system's passive states. Saying that, so you can see that in the second line, where we have the entropy of the passive states in the future given that the active interactive state is, well, in state active, is activated, and that is smaller than the entropy of this future passive state alone, because we can actually induce some information there. We can actually reduce that entropy. So that means that empowerment for this situation where we have an active functional state is larger than 0. Given that inactive interactive processes have no effect whatsoever, empowerment would be 0 if either the active state has the same effect as the inactive state. In that case, the entropy of the passive future interaction processes given the inactive state of the active current interaction process would be the same as if, like for both states, for the active and inactive state. So we can either get this situation where empowerment is 0, or if the active state vanished and only the inactive state was left. In either case, if the system has no effect on its passive state via its interaction processes, empowerment is 0. So an autopoiesis simpliciter system, however, cannot be called, or it can only be called agent. It can only be called agent if and only if its interaction processes realize their functional role. And they can only do so if they are active. A system can thus not be functional if empowerment is 0, but it necessarily needs to be functional in order to be considered an autopoietic agent. Therefore, 0 empowerment indicates a loss of minimal agency in autopoiesis simpliciter. In other words, an autopoietic agent necessarily conserves empowerment. That means keeps it non-zero in order to retain its minimal agency.
Can I interrupt one more time?
Yes, please.
I'm just curious. I feel like I follow your argument almost entirely, but I'm a little bit confused by how you're using the word functional. Can you just clarify what you mean by functional?
Functional as, well, I took the definition from Barandiran and Moreno's 2008 paper. I'm really sorry for pronouncing their names wrong. And where it's defined as, let me look it up. It's defined as influencing, I can only like loosely try to recall this definition, influencing passive interactive states by means of inducing changes in the environment by means of my active interactive states in a way that these changes in the environment which trigger changes on the passive interactive states lead or contribute to the maintenance of autopoiesis.
Okay.
The function in terms of not just influencing those passive interactive states, but actually influencing those passive interactive states in a way that contributes to the maintenance of autopoiesis.
Okay. Thanks.
Cool?
Yeah, that's great.
Well, thank you. All right. So that's the first part of our argument, saying that, so we found that if empowerment is 0, there cannot be agency. So in order to actually preserve agency, an autopoietic system has to preserve or conserve empowerment. So now let's come to the second part here. Second part says, to conserve its autopoiesis, an autopoietic agent necessarily preserves its minimal agency. So in other words, if an autopoietic agent loses its minimal agency, it will also lose autopoiesis. That's quite a general argument. It's not really related to empowerment at all. So I'm curious if this argument has been made before. The essential question here is whether interaction processes are actually normative. Normative also defined by Barandiran and Moreno as processes that are required, that are necessary by other processes in the system. So we're asking whether interaction processes are dynamically presupposed by other processes in their contribution to the overall self-maintenance of an autonomous system. So that's a quote. Let's assume that this is not the case for our argument, and interaction processes in autopathic agents are not normative. Well, active internal processes, or active internal processes, to just stress this correctly, per definition cannot compensate for active interactive processes, as they do operate on the flow of matter and energy between a system's boundary, as they do not operate on the flow of matter and energy between the system's boundary and the environment, they're internal. So in the absence of active interactive processes that we actually want to compensate for, only passive interactive processes could contribute to the satisfaction of a system's dependencies on the environment. So even without interaction processes, active interactive processes, causing functional changes in the environment, passive processes could still be activated by the environment in a functional fashion. So for instance, if previously active interaction processes used to induce random Brownian motion, the system now has to rely on, for instance, osmosis in the environment for nutrients to reach the passive processes. And we can distinguish two cases here. Either the functionality of the passive interaction processes is the same or stronger, or it is weaker than the functionality of the previously active, now inactive or vanished interactive processes. So let's look at the first case. If the system is equipped with passive processes fulfilling the same or stronger function as the interaction processes, so contributing the system's maintenance in the same or stronger fashion, so that's the first case we look at. Well, that's a tricky one, because interaction processes do not simply replace, but actually complement passive processes. Which means that if we have a system which emerged as an autopathic agent, so with a system with interaction processes that necessarily needs passive processes to form like this interaction system, then we have a system which is considerably more complex than a system with passive interactive processes alone. And I consider it less likely that a system with redundant interaction processes would emerge, especially as the available resources in the environment in the process of emergence could be used up by less complex systems that fulfill the same purpose. Well, let's look at a second case, where we assume passive processes fulfilling a weaker function than the vanished, inactive, active interaction processes. Well, in that case, the system could only conserve its autopoiesis if the environmental conditions change in a way that makes a passive process sufficient. However, this change must happen in exactly the same moment when the system loses its minimal agency as in any earlier moment. A similar change in environmental conditions would increase the rate of passive process activation in a way that the rest of the process network would likely be unable to cope with. Now, I consider this coincidence quite unlikely too. So, for me personally, and please tell me if I'm wrong here, there's only a negligible chance for passive interaction processes to fulfill the original functional role of interaction processes in the same system after these interaction processes are gone. And this contradicts our initial assumption, showing that in most circumstances, interaction processes in autopathic agents must be normative. As a consequence, a system which emerged as autopathic agent will very likely become disorganized and lose its autopoiesis once it loses its minimal agency. Right. So if we recall our two claims, we arrive at a rather strong proof. Because we have not only shown that an autopoiesis implicita system must conserve empowerment to keep its minimal agency and thus be called an autopathic agent, but also by transitivity from our second claim that it must conserve empowerment to conserve its autopoiesis. We have first proven our main claim that any autopathic agent necessarily conserves empowerment in a strong sense, but we have also shown that empowerment can be considered a viability indicator, that its values reflect the basic normativity of the autopathic system. However, it's very important to stress here that this only happens by proxy. And that's because zero empowerment does not indicate a system's loss of organization, but a loss of the potential to maintain this organization autonomously. An agent can be recovered from such a state of heteronomy, I would call it, by external intervention, but a loss of autonomy can also mark the beginning of an agent's continuous disintegration, eventually leading to information-theoretic death. It's also a proxy in the sense that under very few circumstances, as we have shown in our second argument, a system's loss of agency could be compensated for by passive interactive processes or by a fortunate change in environmental conditions. By using the notion of empowerment conservation, similar to the conservation of autopoiesis, we want to stress that a system does not actively regulate its processes to keep empowerment high. But its organization must rather emerge from its contained domain in a way that warrants the conservation of empowerment. Crucially, the conservation of empowerment does not relate to and cannot facilitate the emergence of such a system from its containing domain. In contrast, in order to be able to talk about the conservation of empowerment at all, you have to assume an autopoietic agent to be already present.
I just want to interject quickly there, Christian, that's about 20 minutes. Not that we're strict about the time limits, but I've just noticed it still says first part in your slides, so yes, just to give you a heads up.
I'm coming to the second part right now, but
okay,
I would appreciate if you could give me some extra time now that you say
yeah, that's not a problem.
It. Cool. I come to our second part then. I want to show two things here. First of all, I want to show that any adaptive agent must necessarily maintain empowerment, or at least I want to investigate that claim. Secondly, I want to look into the question whether it is sufficient for a system to maintain empowerment to be considered an adaptive agent. And of course, if we could show both things, then the maintenance of empowerment and adaptivity would be the same thing. All right. Adaptivity, just to recall, allows to recover the homeostatic interpretation of autopoiesis generis, that a system can actively regulate its organization to prevent detrimental encounters. And I highlighted the whole range of adaptive systems here in this diagram again. However, for our argument, we restrict ourselves again to adaptive agents, so only to those systems that have active interactive processes. I'm also highlighting this. Now, to come to our claim. Our claim is that any adaptive agent must necessarily maintain empowerment. And as in the previous argument, we again use two subclaims. So, first of all, we look into whether the preservation of agency, whether for the preservation of agency, an adaptive agent must necessarily maintain empowerment. And we can see that the definition of adaptive agency is actually the same as for autopoietic agents. So it's also about having active interactive processes that have a functional impact on the passive interactive processes. Given that, you only have to show that our previous argumentation is invariant to an adaptive system's capacity to actively regulate its organization. Now, what we can show is, or what we can see is, that the capacity to actively regulate processes affects the magnitude of empowerment because we have more, we necessarily need more states on a different interactive processes to distinguish between, actually, in order to have these alternative things to change from, to choose from. And it also affects the frequency of high empowerment states because the system operates, the system acts in order to preserve its agency, its existence, its autopoiesis actively. However, this does not affect the empowerment necessarily is zero if interaction processes are not functional. That remains. So this part of the argument is invariant to the new things that agency brings in here. And an adaptive agent must necessarily, in order to preserve agency, maintain empowerment by means of active regulation of processes. However, how does the situation look like for the second part? So to maintain its autopoiesis, a system which emerged as adaptive agent must necessarily preserve its adaptive agency. That's what we want to show. In other words, if an adaptive agent loses its minimal agency, it will also lose autopoiesis. Again, the question here is whether interaction processes are normative. However, this time we have to consider the system emerged as an adaptive agent. Now, as in the case of autopoiesis implicita, active internal processes cannot compensate for interaction processes, invariant of the system's capacity for active regulation. We thus have to investigate whether we can maintain a system's organization by means of passive interactive processes. By definition, interactions in passive interactive processes can only be induced from outside, or the process is the result of physical-chemical laws without any internally generated constraint acting upon the process. However, this definition of passive interactive processes does not eliminate the possibility that the functionality of these processes could be actively regulated. The definition of adaptivity does also not exclude exception, which is feasible as passive processes are part of the larger process network with recursive dependencies, following the definition of autopoiesis. An adaptive system which has lost its agency could therefore activate, for instance, dormant passive interactive processes or change the state of already activated passive interactive processes to compensate for the loss of functionality. So without additional information about a particular system's constraints on adaptivity, we can consequently not say that a system which emerged as adaptive agent must necessarily preserve its adaptive agency in order to maintain its autopoiesis. So we cannot make this claim without additional information. So in contrast to the case of autopoiesis implicita or autopoietic agents, we can thus only provide a weak proof for our claim that an adaptive agent necessarily maintains empowerment, while a system must necessarily actively regulate its processes with the effect of maintaining empowerment in order to keep its agency. A loss in agency does not necessarily entail a loss of autopoiesis. So we cannot make a strong claim that the empowerment of an adaptive agent relates to the system's viability. However, adaptation mechanisms are usually constrained. It is thus very unlikely that a system which emerged as adaptive agent could possibly compensate for loss of agency in every situation. But that's something we have to look into in more detail. Okay, come to our last claim, which is it is sufficient for a system to maintain empowerment to be considered an adaptive agent. We actually make the critical assumption that interaction processes in adaptive agents are normative. So we couldn't decide that for now, but for now we assume they are. Now, adaptive agency entails both adaptivity and agency, where adaptivity must be understood in terms of both self-monitoring, viability tendencies, and appropriate active regulation of processes to preserve the system's organization. While we do assume that adaptive agency requires the active regulation of interaction processes, we do not assume the capacity for active regulation of internal processes. Empowerment is defined between a system's interaction processes and passive interactive processes, as outlined before, and thus assumes the system to have passive interactive and interaction processes. The option for maintenance, so to keep empowerment at a certain level, requires that there can be different values of empowerment. So this also entails that the system could have some causal influence on its passive interactive processes. In order to maintain empowerment, the system must necessarily be able to actively regulate its interaction processes, so that the regulation leads to a new system state in which empowerment did not decrease. So just as active regulation adaptivity, the maintenance of empowerment thus requires a decoupled regulatory subsystem. So empowerment actually already comes with quite a few implicit requirements. So it already subsumes a couple of adaptivities requirements, namely those of active regulation and self-monitoring. However, this active regulation must be functional on the interaction processes to complete the requirement of agency. And it has to lead to the preservation of the system's organization to sufficiently meet the requirement of adaptivity. The empowerment quantity, however, can be non-zero, although the impact of interaction processes on the environment are not functional. So we have to look at functionality, at the question whether regulation, active regulation, can introduce this functionality and whether it can introduce the preservation of autopoiesis separately. And we look at the functionality claim first. So for the maintenance of empowerment, so we first look at the functional role of regulation. For the maintenance of empowerment, the system selects a regulative alternative state at time t, which keeps empowerment at time t+1 on the same level as previously. However, since the interaction network is assumed to be normative, the internal constructive network at t+2 depends on its sanity, on the sanity of the interaction processes at t+1, which is warranted if empowerment is non-zero at t+1. So by selecting an empowerment maintaining alternative at t, the system preserves the normative process network that the system depends on at t+2. The selection of alternatives at t is thus functional as it contributes to the maintenance of the system. The question then, of course, is, are these alternatives sufficiently functional to preserve the system's organization? And this is where it actually gets a bit tricky and where this argument probably needs more improvement. So without loss of generality, we assume that the system in question can only regulate states of interaction processes and not of other internal processes. This means that it can either keep or switch states of its interaction processes at time t, which consequently cause changes in the environment at t+1 that impact the system's passive processes and thus indirectly its internal constructive network. The interaction network, however, is still partially coupled and dependent on that internal constructive network. The interaction network, that thing that we actually want to maintain, still depends on the internal constructive network which we influence. So by maintaining empowerment, the system thus brings the internal constructive network into a state in which it can maintain the interactive network. However, this would trivially work with any system internal quantity because ultimately the quantity can only be measured if the system exists. However, this could lead us into a state where the system's organization favors the preservation of this quantity, while essential processes that are important for the future maintenance of the system are neglected. Empowerment, however, quantifies the sanity of a normative part of the system's organization. Normative is the key term here. So if we cannot steer every process in a system by means of active regulation, we can assume that good interaction processes are an indicator for a healthy organization, so that our available action has steered the system into a healthy state. If an alternative selected at t leads to the maintenance of empowerment at t+1, you can thus assume that it also preserved the system's organization. Empowerment is thus functional in two ways: in preserving the organization at t+1 and in preserving a normative part of the system that is needed for its preservation at t+2. Now, if we restrict the active regulation and empowerment maintenance to interaction processes, maintaining empowerment at t means to preserve the potential to maintain empowerment at t+1, because we actually use the interaction processes to maintain empowerment at t+1. More generally, empowerment maintenance between t and t+1 requires to maintain the system's normative processes which allow for the interaction processes to persist at t+1. And Mascherano and Varela proposed this second-order homeostasis as an alternative definition for autopoiesis. I put a quote here. By using the notion of homeostasis, we believe that second-order homeostasis represents an alternative definition of autopoiesis generis, not autopoiesis simpliciter, as one might think. So a system which is not only able to conserve autopoiesis, but to maintain it by means of active homeostasis. We consequently have shown that by maintaining empowerment, an agent maintains adaptivity. Or at least that's what we want to show. And I think this argument probably needs a bit more improvement. All right. So to come to the end, this is clearly still early days, and crucial elements of our argumentation are still under debate, or crucial notions in here. And I've got a couple of critical open questions, and it would be great if you guys could help me addressing some of them, or could help me clarifying some of them, for instance, by commenting on this video. So one question is, for instance, what is really the nature of active and passive processes? How do they relate to the concepts of sensors and actuators, as Matthew already addressed? can adaptive agents maintain autopoiesis after having lost the agency? So can we actually decide on this better than on a case-by-case basis and therefore support our argument? Could systems emerge as adaptive systems without agency but become an adaptive agent throughout adaptation? So could actually a system which has lost its interaction processes could bootstrap new functional interaction processes? Is second-order homeostasis really an alternative definition of autopoiesis generis and thus adaptivity? And does constitutive autonomy entail passive autopoietic systems? I'm not so sure about this, because passive autopoietic systems, to me, feel like systems that only keep their existence because they are kind of, they're mutually merged with the environment, so that the environment system is a coupled system where the environment takes over a lot of the autonomy of the system itself, but I'm not sure about this. So, to come to conclusion in future work, while our arguments are still preliminary, and there is much space for improvement, we have found some deep connections between empowerment as formal model of intrinsic motivation and the concepts of autopoiesis and adaptivity. And I just want to note that Matthew and a collaborator in 2016 have proposed to use the distance between the state of a system's current essential variables and its viability boundary as a means to identify viability indicators, which could form the basis of an agent's normativity. Now, we want to propose here empowerment as a particularly universal and robust candidate for such a viability indicator, which only relies on the identification of a small set of processes and which scales across different agent morphologies. There's a high-level abstraction from essential variables, only working on the interaction processes. You would expect to find strong correlation between an agent's distance and viability space and its empowerment. To wrap up, I've shown that any autopoietic agent must necessarily maintain empowerment, maintain both its agency and its autopoiesis. This qualifies empowerment as a viability indicator for autopoiesis in bliss test systems. In respect to adaptive agents, however, we could only show that an adaptive agent must necessarily maintain empowerment by means of active regulation in order to keep its agency. Without additional information on the constraints on active regulation in a particular system, we cannot judge the quality of empowerment as viability proxy in adaptive systems. It is a good proxy if the system cannot actively regulate its passive interactive processes, that's for sure. But we need to know that. Crucially, the maintenance of empowerment cannot contribute to the physical formation of an autopoietic system. We have finally proposed, well, we haven't, I would like to talk about that later, but I'm just going to spoil it. Well, we believe that empowerment relates to the concept of open-ended development. It could be handy in exploring this yet under-researched concept by both theoretical means and simulation studies. For future work, we certainly want to refine and extend our arguments. For instance, we would like to relate empowerment more closely to the final statements that Ezequiel Di Paolo makes on the properties of adaptivity. We would like to complement our theoretical arguments with simulation studies in which the internal organization of agents is explicitly included and energetic and material requirements are also modeled. And we are particularly interested in how including introspective sensors and actuators in an agent's world would actually increase the sensitivity of empowerment with respect to an agent's viability and allow for interoceptive regulation. We would also like to investigate the suitability of other models of intrinsic motivation as viability indicators in autopoietic and adaptive systems. This entails the interesting question if, and if so, why empowerment is more closely related to autopoiesis than other models, for instance, exploratory models, models of curiosity, for instance. My best guess right now is that any such model must be able to quantify the sanity of a normative process. Well, that's it for now. There's much more to say, but time is limited. Thank you very much, Matthew, for giving me a couple of additional minutes. I appreciate your comments on this and your help in developing this further. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Christian. Really appreciate the talk. It's really interesting stuff. And nice to see some connections with some of these formal ideas of empowerment and everything as well. I'm just going to take one moment or two just to remind any of our viewers, because we do have a few people watching right now. I'm going to share my screen and show people how do I do this? Stop presenting and then present to everyone. So hopefully, application window. Hopefully everybody can see my screen now.
Sure. So what's the usual routine here? Am I supposed to close my presentation and come and switch on my video stream?
Yeah, that would be great if we could see. It depends on how much I suppose you want to. You're going to want to refer to your slides as we ask some questions. But really,
well, I guess it depends on the question, right? But well, let's switch for now, and I can switch back later.
Great. Can you confirm that you see this slide that I've put up on the screen?
I can see that, yeah.
Great. So this is just information for people. If you would like to join in this question and answer session now, it's not too late. Just send me an email to that address right there, mde@matthewegbert.com, and I'll send you an invitation link, and you can join in some of the conversation live and ask a question to Christian. Alternatively, if you're watching this on YouTube after the fact, we do really like to have discussion on about the talk afterwards on the ENSO seminar website. So please don't comment on the actual YouTube page, but instead there'll be a link on the YouTube page, or you can go straight to the ENSO seminar website, find Christian's talk, not Inman's, and scroll down, and at the bottom there's a nice discus forum that we've had in the past, some really nice, interesting, and detailed discussion on. And I think that would also be a great forum for discussing some of the ideas that Christian's put forward in his talk now. So there's that information. I'm going to go back to this page here. And yeah, it's infinite regress. And there's Christoph. Great. Let me turn off my screen sharing here.
Yeah, it's probably important to mention that well, Matthew just said Christoph, but probably not everyone knows. So Christoph Salge, my collaborator on this paper, just joined the chat. So that's probably nice. Nice to have you here as well, Christoph.
Mm-hmm. I thought maybe I could kick off some of the discussion. Peter Cariani is here, but he said that he's been having a bit of challenges with his microphone, unfortunately. So he sent a question to me by way of email.
Actually, can you hear me now?
Oh yeah,
yeah.
We can hear you.
I think I got the video working.
You did.
Hi.
Hi.
I have a couple of basic questions. The first is about empowerment and autopoiesis. Now, you know, there are tunicates, sea squirts, that are sort of like tadpoles in their larval stages, and then they become filter feeders in the adult stage, and they digest about 90% of their nervous systems. So their degree of empowerment goes down in their adult phase, but they're still autopoietic systems. So, I mean, a system can be sort of in declining control of its environment, but still be autopoietic if it's self-regenerating, self-sustaining. So I think there's a little bit of a decoupling between those two ideas. It helps, obviously, if you can influence your environment, because then that helps you regulate your internal organization and maintain that. But it's not necessarily essential for being able to maintain an internal organization if the environment is stable. I mean, that's the first point.
Yeah.
The second point
Why don't you, Kristen, do you want to respond to that first? Or do you have any?
Well, shoot away with the second point, please.
Well, I was just wondering, you know, I've been fairly out of this whole discussion over the years. My doctoral work was on open-endedness and emergence in percept action systems. You know, my concept of agency is tied to the notion of a purposive system, that there are embedded goals in the system, and a system is agentive, or it's an agent to the extent that it has embedded goals and it has the means and autonomy to be able to pursue those goals. Now, I don't don't have the I don't know what your definition of agency is, or whether it's just being able to influence the states of the external environment, or whether it also includes the notion that those changes have to be functional vis-a-vis some set of internal identifiable goals. So that's my second question.
Okay. Well, when it comes to the first question, I'm not entirely sure if I got your example right. I mean, what we're saying here is that an autopoietic agent, and I doubt that the system that you mentioned is, or the animal you mentioned is actually an autopoietic agent. It's probably rather an adaptive agent. The
tunicate?
Precisely. Well, that's rather a adaptive agent, and I've just shown that. I've just pointed at the issue.
Why isn't it an autopoietic?
Well, according to, it is. Well, based on the distinction that I made, and it took me a while to find my way around here, and I'm not sure if it's correct, but based on the distinction I made, we have autopoiesis implicita on one hand. That's what I refer to when I say autopoietic. We have adaptivity, which comes on top of that, which together forms a bigger class of autopoiesis generis system. So yes, it is autopoietic in terms of autopoiesis generis, but it also entails adaptivity. That's what I mean.
Okay.
But I'm just saying it's not an autopoietic simpliciter system because it can actually actively regulate its states during its lifetime.
It actively regenerates its structure. I don't know that I don't know how adaptive they are.
So part what Christian's saying is that in a sense, in addition to being autopoietic and self-constructing, it also has adaptive properties. He's saying it's not just autopoietic. It's autopoietic and it's adaptive. He's saying that the fact that it loses some of its empowerment doesn't mean that it loses all of it, is what I understand. Is that part of what you're saying?
There are two things here. Okay, if we assume that the tunica is not only autopoietic simpliciter, it doesn't only conserve its autopoiesis, but it actually actively regulates it. Then we have to recall the second argument we made today, or the second part of this presentation, where we actually talk about adaptive agents, not autopoietic agents. So talking about adaptive agents, I've shown that empowerment relates to the existence of agency, where agency is about having an active, interactive process that fulfills a functional role. But I've shown that that in this case, for adaptive agents, we cannot show that empowerment always relates to the system's viability, because there are cases in which loss of interaction processes can be compensated for, right? And that's perfectly fine for a system which is in a very homogeneous environment, which settled in a certain place, actually doesn't need interaction processes anymore. For instance, motility. It could just get rid of all these processes, drop empowerment, still survive. And we haven't ruled that out. We've actually said, well, we have this issue here. That's why we cannot claim in general that empowerment is a good viability indicator for adaptive agents. We only can decide on a case-by-case basis. Or I'm interested if there are more distinctions here that would help us make this distinction.
Okay, good. It's always useful to bring in, concrete examples in these sorts of analyses.
Yes.
Just a suggestion.
No, because right, and I'm on it.
Okay, good.
And I'm considering a couple of concrete examples, but please give me a bit more time to work on this. Right. Like one example for a autopoietic simpliciter system, for instance, which does not have empowerment, but could still maintain its autopoiesis, is it's this one bacterium called let me look it up again. I found it very interesting. So there are such systems.
Is this a symbiotic bacteria that essentially uses its host to regulate its
precisely.
environment?
Guckelsberger. Yeah, precisely. So, and I wonder, and that's like a general thing I would like to hear your opinion about, can we still describe these systems as constitutively autonomous?
Yeah, I have a one comment to make on that front. So a long time ago, I wrote a paper that was trying to look at the idea of behavior in autopoietic systems. And so I created a model that had this basic constitutive autonomy, the self-constructing process. And then in addition to that, I added a few more sort of chemical reactions to my system that allowed it to move around its environment in a more effective way. And I constructed the system so that it was possible for its behavior to die in a sense. So its behavior was also a self-maintaining process, but it was one that was possible to sort of kill the behavioral process, the regulation of its environment by way of movement, and to have left over its constitutive autonomy. So these two things were somewhat decoupled, and you might find it interesting as another concrete example for evaluating your ideas. One of the reasons you might find it interesting is because even when I knocked out the additional behavioral mechanism, it still had the autopoiesis, the constitutive autonomy, still caused the system to move around just in a slightly less effective way.
I think I remember that, who was it? Ikegami and Suzuki have also modeled a system which is capable of inducing Brownian random motion.
That's right. Or even chemotaxis, yeah. That's right.
Yeah, without any adaptivity involved, which is actually quite fascinating.
Yeah.
But coming back to the example, did you actually model energetic material dependencies in the system?
Energetic dependencies, is that what you said?
Yeah, did you model them as well?
Yeah, not in great detail, but yes, there was some basic concept of thermodynamics in the system.
Cool.
But the reason, yeah, the thing that I just wanted to comment on with all of those examples is I'm just wondering if it's ever possible to have autopoiesis without some regulation of the autopoiesis, if you know what I mean. So you're teasing apart these two possibilities, saying it's possible that you could have a system that's autopoietic, but it is or is not regulating that autopoiesis. And
yes,
in all of my experiences, the autopoiesis is almost has to be, it involves this feedback, right? It's kind of a feedback process. It just always entails that. And feedback almost always entails some kind of regulation. If there's any negative feedback in the system, then there's going to be some regulation going on. And it just seems to me like these systems, if they don't have to, then they at least very often seem to include some regulation. And
I can totally see that, and I also noticed that because they're like all examples you can find on this autopoiesis simpliciter are basically theoretical models of autopoiesis simpliciter, or I guess synthetic chemistry. But beyond that, it's getting really tricky if you look into nature. And for me personally, it was a very important step to look closely into these concepts, because the distinction between the mechanisms autopoiesis simpliciter and autopoiesis generis always not too obvious in literature. So for me, it was important to distinguish these concepts clearly, also in order to make a clear argument where empowerment applies, where it doesn't apply, where we cannot really tell exactly and why. So I thought like dissecting the underlying mechanisms helped a lot in developing this argument.
Cool. So just to clarify, the Varela's model back in the 70s, the 74 classic cellular automaton model of autopoiesis, that's autopoiesis simpliciter, right?
That's my feeling as well.
Right, okay. And then the extension by Keisuke Suzuki and Takashi Ikegami is a step towards, it's a minimal extension of that model, right? It just has a gradient of the resource chemical, if I remember correctly, and the membrane's modified a little bit to make it so it doesn't, it's a little bit easier for it to move. But even with those minimal additions, it becomes, there's some kind of regulation going on. The organism moves up the gradient to
yes, but I think the really fascinating bit about this model is that it can do so without active regulation. So we get some sort of chemotaxis here, but without active regulation, as far as I remember it correctly. I would have to look into it again as well.
But I'm not quite sure what you mean there by the active regulation. That's what I'm trying to tease apart. Is it possible? Yeah. What is that? Is it necessary?
Yeah.
Well, and is it distinguishable from the autopoietic process?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in general, I mean, what is the essential distinction of having a regulatory apparatus? I don't know. I'm asking that as a rhetorical question.
No, me too. And I'm thinking about it and wondering. And it's one that has come back in a lot of conversations I've had, because you will see these diagrams that have an arrow that's talking about this process is regulating this other arrow, and it's always a little bit hard to disentangle what is that regulation, what does that entail, and when is it not there? Again, trying to use these models, the classic models of autopoiesis, as examples to work with. When is it there and when is it not there? It's an interesting and, to me, very still open question.
Well, that's very good to know for me, because developing a feeling what questions are still under debate and which ones aren't is really, really nice and really good. To come back to the Ikigami and Suzuki question, I think Tom Fröser and Tom Ziemke listed in their 2009 paper on inactive AI as an example of autopoietic systems. Yes, self-constituting systems which are embedded in sensory motor interactions but which are not yet adaptive. Interesting to read that once again.
So I had a couple of other questions, a little bit about some of the details of the empowerment measure. In fact, it's going back to this concept of functionality, or things being functional or not, because you talked about Barandiaran and Moreno's concept of functional, and this idea of active interactive processes influencing substantively the passive interactive processes, right? And this sort of feedback loop of going out in the environment and coming back. And that sounds great, but it seems to me like the functional thing that Barandiaran and Moreno are talking about is not captured, and I'm hoping you're going to show me where I'm wrong, but it's not captured in the empowerment measures, precisely because there is not any normative aspect to it. So it seems like the empowerment measure is saying, does this variable influence that variable? So the action could be something, you could have a self-destroying system that would have a high degree to which the active interactive processes influence the passive interactive processes. And so the measure, as I understand, would give it a high score, but this would be a really anti-functional kind of relationship, right? Where the system's essentially destroying itself or damaging itself. Am I misguided there? Do I misunderstand something about the measure?
No, you didn't. I also mentioned it briefly early on. Empowerment itself measures how much influence the system has on its passive interactive state via its active interactive states, but it cannot measure whether this influence is functional or not. Well, right. That is the question, right? The default vanilla empowerment model, which only evaluates action or regulative tendencies one step into the future, cannot do that. That's why in our argumentation we have not focused on empowerment and the functionality of empowerment, but of the functional role of selecting change in state that maintains empowerment. We have shown that, at least I believe we have shown that, by selecting according to the maintenance of empowerment, we actually, while empowerment itself is not functional. We can look into, as an additional remark, we can look into extensions of empowerment, where we do not only evaluate the consequences of one time step of regulation, but of multiple time steps into the future. The interesting thing then is if we have a state, if we distinguish between different states we could go to, that we could navigate to by appropriate active regulation. And this multi-step, n-step empowerment in these states is high. It indicates that we are actually able, given the current model of the action about the world dynamics, we're able to loop steps in the future, which actually indicates that those states are more healthy than others, which brings back some functionality. But actually, that's an interesting question. So far, we're only able to locate functionality in the selection of actions which then maintain empowerment, but not in the empowerment maintenance itself.
Yeah, interesting.
So is empowerment only defined in terms of, is functionality only defined vis-a-vis empowerment per se, the ability to influence the environment, or are there other metrics in terms of system imperatives or goals so there are other because the biological, to make a functional model of a biological system, and I'm thinking of Miller's Living Systems, that big book with functionalist sort of models of everything. You need to have a set of goals and performance metrics that are then improved or degraded by changes in the system. And so there's sort of a difference between purely dynamical models, which really are dealing with system trajectories within some sort of state space, and functional models that actually have some metrics about performance vis-a-vis some observables, like what is the rate of pumping blood through a heart, or how well can a bat in flight regulate it, avoid obstacles, let's say, or whatever. So is your concept of functionality or empowerment and functionality only involve the degree to which one affects the states of the environment, or does it have to do with affecting those states of the environment that are important for internal goals, like self-regulation, but also potentially other goals?
The latter. So if we talk about functionality and empowerment here, we talk about two distinct concepts, one which has been previously defined, functionality, and empowerment, which we bring to the table. And we consider functionality as the capacity of an interaction process to induce changes in a passive process which contribute to the self-maintenance of the system.
Okay, so all functions are tied to self-maintenance.
Yes.
Okay.
But empowerment is not. Or not, it's not guaranteed to be. You're still interested in that relationship, right?
I'm still interested in that. It is guaranteed to be bound to that in the case of orthopedics and blister systems. We cannot be too sure about adaptive systems. And it's also interesting to look into different formulations of empowerment here as well. Maybe there's some models that can actually give us more information about the capacity to maintain empowerment multiple steps in the future, which again would bring in some functionality, because that capacity to maintain empowerment in the future would express that a system in the meantime did not deteriorate.
So one thing that Ezekiel talked about a while ago, he's brought up a few different times in conversations I've had with him, is this idea of, it relates to concepts of habit and the idea of self-maintaining patterns of behavior. And this idea of how do you create, it's one thing, we've got examples like Hebbian learning or other examples and Ezekiel's models or some models I've also worked with where you've got a mechanism of behavior that is itself self-maintaining. So it's the behavior, it's not all norms are grounded in the self-preservation of the organism, but some other norms also exist and are defined by the presence of patterns of behavior. So you have self-maintaining habits of behavior, or self-maintaining your who you think you are. All of these different things are, in a sense, also the source of norms. And I'm just wondering if this empowerment idea can also be extended to some of those, to some things in those arena, because it is decoupled in a sense from the actual constitutive processes, right? When you're doing these measures, when you're looking at the systems, you're picking out some variables, you're measuring essentially information theoretical correlation between variables. And I wonder if similar things can be done. And I guess one thing that I'm wondering about this related to this is is there a principled way that you get to choose which variables are active interactive and which are passive interactive? Or is that something that you're doing as an external observer, a sort of prescriptive saying these are the ones I want to call that, these are the ones I want to call that, therefore I'll do that?
Okay. Okay, there are a couple of questions here. I'm not entirely sure if I can really respond to the first part, because in that case I would probably have to look into this equality Paulus work first. So when it comes to the second part, in this case you can, well, of course, we approach this from a perspective of, like the synthetic engineering of artificial agents, where you could easily disambiguate which processes are active, which processes are passive, sensors, actuators, and so on and so forth. If you consider it in the domain of like organisms, the first thing you can see is that you can clearly delineate between the constructive and the interactive internal network by means of the notion of a Markov blanket. So the interactive network is the Markov blanket of the constructive internal network. It's all we need to know in order to specify the state of the internal network. That allows us to delineate the interactive part from the constructive part, at least in theory, right?
Okay.
Can't be the ideas for field studies. Well, then we end up with a number of processes that are all interactive, but we don't know which ones are active, which ones are passive. Then we can draw on the definition of Barandier and Moreno. We say that, well, active processes are constrained by the system's own organization. Their states are changed by the system's own organization, versus by passive processes, they're only activated, interactions only induced from outside the system, or by chemical processes that do not underlie the constraints of the system's organization. So there's a number of definitions here we can use to disambiguate between these interactive states. But how to do this in an actual, like, I'm not sure if we can employ empowerment to actively identify between these different states. I guess we could, but that needs, you could potentially take, if let's say you get like, you have a system, you have a number of interactive states, you don't know if they're passive or active. You could calculate the empowerment between these different states, and you could check how the information flows between these states. And you could probably use this as a guide to see which states are the active and which are the passive states. But I don't know if it's really inappropriate to do that.
Why? Why is it inappropriate?
Why it's inappropriate to me? Yes.
I mean, so...
Because that just feels like an exponential effort, right? You would have to try out every combination. The question would be, is there some guiding principle you can use to actually guide this process?
I mean, way back in the dark ages of the 80s, I worked out a methodology for distinguishing between measurements and internal determinate processes and actions. And you can, if you have a system of a robot with sensors and effectors, you can demarcate the internal state transitions of the computational part from the contingent state transitions of the measurement part. And so there's a realm of internal circular causality that's determinate. And then there are contingencies at the boundaries of the organism environment functional boundaries, and one can demarcate these regions of causality, internal causality versus external contingency, of these systems, and I think it's. I think we can do that, and we need to do that if we're going to be clear about the difference between a measurement or sensing process and a acting or affecting process, and a computation or an internal determinate state transition process.
But there's always this question, right, of how do you distinguish between the agent and the environment? So you can create this interface, but what drives the asymmetry between across that interface of one side being an agent, the other being the environment? And a lot of the inactive autopoiesis stuff is driven by this idea that the agent is the thing that's precarious and that needs to perform a set of actions to continue to persist. It's sort of networking. And that I don't see, that's not present in the empowerment stuff, right? The empowerment stuff, very similar, or in a way that's comparable to like Randy Beer's stuff with dynamical systems. Randy's a big fan, is very interested in active concepts, but he's also done a whole lot of work that's just looking at how behavior could be accomplished, assuming that all of this self-constructing stuff is going on below. And that's kind of what I see here. It's you're interested in the inaction stuff. You like the ideas and are trying to figure out ways to work with them. But as I understand it, the measures that you're working with are quite agnostic with regard to the inactive principles, as I see it, because it could be applied on either side. It's how you choose, which is I'll leave it there.
Well, I mean, there's no necessary frame that you have to look at the system in. So depending upon how you choose your observables on the system, you may see an organism with a set of self-production processes and internal causality states demarcated from another realm of state transitions that are not determinate and are distinct from that. So you can draw boundaries if you want to, if you choose the right frame, but the frame itself is arbitrary. So if you want to see the system as a big dynamical system, you can also look at it from that point of view. But if you look at it from that point of view, then all those boundaries will disappear and all those distinctions will disappear, and you'll just have, a state transition system, a big state transition system, and you can't really talk about sensing or affecting or any of these functional notions.
But so, Christian's talking about like the norms coming out of the precariousness of the agent, but the precariousness of the agent is not present in the model, or it's not. There's no way you can even find it in the model, right? There's no. Is that incorrect?
Well, that's a question, right? And I mean, the first two claims we've made is assume an autopoietic agent or an adaptive agent respectively to be present, right? So in that case, we do not address, we simply do not address how these systems came about, and empowerment is not related to that. Well, you could say, given that empowerment appears to be necessary in adaptive agents, that it could help us identify the initial conditions under which those agents emerge. If you think of Adami, for instance, Libar, and this idea of biased, what do you call them? Biased. I'm not sure how they call it, but basically to have a bias in an environment with a bias in the substances are in these environments that then are more likely to give rise to certain self-constructing systems. But
favorable
then again,
environments.
Sorry?
Favorable environments.
Favorable environments for self-emergence. Yeah.
Helpful environments.
Yeah. So you could consider, if an agent necessarily has to maintain empowerment in order to be an autopoietic agent, then this could probably put constraints on the conditions of in an environment to give rise to such an agent. Regarding the other bit, there is an intrinsic notion of viability in empowerment, in that, and it also addresses like quite a key idea of enactivism, in that empowerment is calculated on, or empowerment relates to the potential consequences of an agent's regulation or actions.
Mm-hmm.
It is formed by evaluating how the agent's actions, regulations affect what the agent can perceive. So that's about perception by acting. There is viability in there, in that if you calculate empowerment on a system which is about to disorganize, if you calculate, and the internal model is aware of that,
Mm-hmm.
awareness, right, quotation marks, then empowerment would go down.
Mm-hmm.
Because you would evaluate all the different things you can perform. You can see, well, you can't do that any longer, right? It all collapses in one state, and that is the same state, right?
Yeah, but I see that as a correlation or a coincidence of some kind, because I think it's possible to construct, at least in terms of thought experiments, situations where, and this goes back, I think, to one of Peter's first points, where the empowerment goes right down, maybe not all the way down to nothing being possible, but it goes right down to just about nothing, no choices being made, yet viability remains quite high. The system's going to persist, it's doing well, it's in an environment, it's like, it can make no choices, but it's a prisoner in a prison cell where it can do nothing, but everything's provided for it. And so there's a definite correlation between these things, but I don't think they're one and the same. I mean, not that you're claiming that they are, of course, but yeah.
No, I mean, we're talking about a proxy here, right? And it's probably also important to note that, so Ezequiel DiPaolo made this nice example of an autopoietic agent falling down a cliff. And actually, autopoiesis still be maintained while falling, although the consequence is absolutely clear. Well, we could imagine situations where a system has to undergo a zero empowerment situation, a situation in which it cannot inject any information into the environment, which would impact in a functional way on its passive processes. For instance, just imagine a system, a motility-based agent flying through the air, right, in free fall. In this case, whatever the agent does just results in the same outcome dictated by physics, right? However, if we use a multi-step, n-step model of empowerment, we can look further away in the future. We can actually go through this, can try to navigate, we can see through this empowerment bottleneck and say, okay, while our actions constrain our options first, they will be opened later on, right? We go through this small corridor, but after the corridor, something very special awaits. And by using the right model of empowerment, you can look quite further into the future and actually do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Probably just an important thing to note.
Yeah, I do see your point. Yeah, it's interesting.
I've like these different models of empowerment with like further with larger look aheads into the future also help us to build up a gradient to not make our Umwelt only black and white, all right? To make it multifaceted. But I had no time to talk about that yet.
Mm. I also, just to bring it up one more time, I think it would be really interesting to take some of these ideas and look at them in the context, not just of self-maintaining organisms, but self-maintaining patterns of behavior. So there's this whole idea of the mind being like a bundle of habits, right? So you have all of these different processes that are going on, and they're all vying for control a little bit. They're all maybe competing with each other, maybe working together sometime, and each one of them is a self-maintaining dynamic of some kind. And something we haven't figured out how to model in those ideas is how these things might adapt so as to increase their chances of persisting. And it's something that I've been interested in trying to figure out for a long time, but I feel like there might be something in what you guys are doing with empowerment that might be a way that we could figure that out, so that you have some system that changes sensory input into motor output, essentially, in a way that reinforces that very mechanism. But then how do we make it adapt? And maybe empowerment is a way forward there. So we should chat about that a bit more offline, perhaps.
Yeah, we definitely should. I will probably have a look at literature first. Get in there. Something else to note, like something I would really like to put forward here as well, is the connection between empowerment and open-ended development. Because I have no time to really talk about that in the presentation, but I think it's quite interesting. If you consider that The inactive concepts of autopoiesis, adaptivity, and needful freedom are kind of too passive to explain the open-ended drive of many living beings, which is an essential characteristic of the living. And in fact, if you look at the definition of adaptivity, for instance, it only seems to explain how organisms respond to negative tendencies, but not how they move forward towards positive tendencies. And Barandiaran and Moreno in the same paper observed that, and that's a quote I got here on a piece of paper, in most cases, adaptive regulation takes place not just by transforming outward tendencies into inward trajectories, so not just by avoiding negative tendencies, seeking to improve the state of essential variables so that regulation takes place not just in reference to the boundary of viability, but graded and directed by a sense of well-being, which they do not explain any further. And we wonder if empowerment is a measure of the preparedness of an agent. You have to imagine, like, we get high empowerment. We only have differentiated between zero and non-zero empowerment here, because there was no time to talk about anything else. But empowerment is graduated, and you get a high empowerment if you have a maximum influence on your environment and through the environment on your sensors or passive processes. And in the deterministic case, when transitions are deterministic, you disambiguate between the different sensor states or passive process states that you can actually create. That means high empowerment means the option to create all sorts of different passive process states, which Christoph in an earlier paper has associated with the notion of preparedness. Well, the question is if such a preparedness could contribute to a sense of well-being, if it could relate to the sense of well-being, if by creating more, by acting so that we can in the future have more options to influence our passive processes and therefore also to satisfy dependencies for our system on the environment, we could potentially move further away from the viability boundary. And if you look at the definition of Di Paolo, this definition of adaptivity only talks about an agent regulating in some circumstances. And it talks about situations of a system state being sufficiently close to the viability boundary. So the question is if actually constantly maximizing empowerment could drive open-ended development. And there are examples where, again, that's some work by Christoph, where we have virtual agent with an artificially imposed viability constraint, just saying that if you hit this flow of lava in that brick world, your motility will be gone. So it's not about really internal organization, it's just about motility vanishing, right? Or whatever you do will result in the same thing, so empowerment will become zero. There is no actual constant threat to this agent in this scenario. But the agent still navigates to the flow of lava and builds a bridge over it to access bigger parts of the environment. And that's actually quite fascinating, because there's no pressure to do anything to preserve the system's existence, but it still moves around, it still does stuff, options, by maximizing empowerment. Mm. And you can see that this is multifaceted, and it's really important to look at the graduation of empowerment. And in some cases, it would be interesting would be necessary, it would be the best choice for a system like the Tunica that we mentioned early on to reduce empowerment, actually. But the interesting question then is, when is that the most sensible choice? Can we actually trade it off against energetic material requirements? Maybe that's the point, right?
Yeah. The thing that jumps to my mind with that, I think I saw, is it possible, did you, was that presented in Mexico, the lava bridge building?
Yes.
Yes, cool. I think I remember that. And the thing that pops in my mind with it is, how could this actually be instantiated in a biological agent? Because in that model, there's this sort of global knowledge of the environment. And in the way that empowerment is described, it's this mathematical formalism. So one might suggest that brains are calculating doing that math, which sort of goes back to this, to do that, they'd have to be building a model of the world. And this goes back to this sort of classic GoFi, very non-inactivist view of what's going on. And so that's one thing that I wonder about there, as opposed to, so I like it on the one hand, because it has this idea, viability indicators and trying to figure out what is the system responding to, and this being a way, like as you proposed, an alternative viability indicator. But it doesn't seem like one that it's ones that we can observe as outside third-party observers, external observers, especially in these artificial worlds that we construct. But as something that an organism could actually do itself, I don't see how that could happen. Have you guys thought about that? Do you have any insight into how that might actually happen?
There are a couple of things here, right? One thing is about the calculation of empowerment. The other thing is about the requirement in having like a model of the environment.
Right.
For empowerment, I don't think like biological system necessarily has to calculate empowerment explicitly. It could also realize the maintenance of empowerment by a set of underlying drives, right?
Underlying what, sorry?
Underlying drives, underlying variables. It doesn't necessarily need to be a calculation of empowerment. It could just behave with it because maintaining, maximizing empowerment, right? Which this situation comes down to that. So we could still impose this observer stance. When it comes to the model, of course you could consider a biological system to build a model of the environment, which not necessarily contradicts with an activist with the freedom of representation and activism, because representations we would need in a model for empowerment would be no different than sensory motor contingencies, really. However, there are approaches out there to calculate empowerment without an actual model based on reinforcement learning. So there's quite a big body of work out there, quite a few papers, 2 or 3 or 4 papers, where they've used reinforcement learning to estimate empowerment without having an explicit model
in
the agent.
That confuses me, but I think that's my absence of knowledge. Maybe that's something I need to look into some more, yeah.
It's cool stuff. I can forward you some papers.
Okay. I unfortunately need to start to wrap things up here. We've got our departmental Christmas party coming up, and I need to go get ready for that. So at least it's for something fun.
I think by now I missed it.
But thanks very much for the interesting talk, Christian. And again, for anybody watching on YouTube after the fact, please put your questions up on the ENSO Seminars website. Again, we've had some great discussion there, and I think this material really lends itself to some of that kind of discussion. The verbal stuff is great. It's sort of loose, but sometimes when people write down ideas, they state them a bit more precisely, and that can also be really fun and productive. So thanks again, Christian, and thank you everybody for joining. Thanks for coming, Peter and Christoph. Nice to have you here, and we'll see you next year.
Yes. Well.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Well.